Good morning, everyone. My name is Michael Carter, Senior Advisor to the President, Chief Diversity Officer here at Sinclair Community College, and I am really pleased that we have with us Dr. Ross Coen, that's going to share some great information with us about Sundown Towns. Excited about this presentation. We've got a lot of you who have joined this. Before we get going, there's a couple things I want to do. One is you saw the slideshow of different things coming up. For some of you, sometimes I don't get this right. The slides are moving pretty quickly. You want to find out more information, please go to the website, www.sinclair.edu/diversity, and the calendar will come up and you can participate. We have some exciting things, as you can see, coming up, and we really want you to participate. I will mention the Some of Us book read. If you participate in that, you will get, especially for right now, the first entries are for Sinclair employees, students, and staff. So if you participate, you'll get a book, the Some of Us book, and we will have Heather McGee with us February 4th at 4 o'clock. And then you've got plenty of time, got the whole semester to read the book, because the conversations will occur at the end of January. So excited about that. But without further ado, let's get started. I want to introduce you to our guest. Dr. Ross Coen is a historian of the American West, Alaska, and the Arctic. He's the author of 3 books, and his scholarly and popular writings have appeared in Blackpast, Pacific Northwest Quarterly, the Northern Review, Alaska Magazine, and other publications. Coen holds a PhD in history from the University of Washington. His current book project, which I'm really interested to find out more about, examines the history of civil rights activism in Alaska by African Americans and Alaska Natives. And with that, let's get started with this conversation. I think before we delve into the discussion, it would be important for us to acknowledge a gentleman who did quite a bit of the research and really introduced America to sundown towns on a large scale. And that's James Loewen, who passed away in August of this year at 79 years of age. And you probably are familiar with possibly Sundown Towns, but also his other books, Lies My Teacher Told Me, Lies Across America, and other publications and books that he has written. Just an outstanding scholar that presented a lot of information that a lot of America had never talked about before. So we want to acknowledge that work, and our conversation along these lines is based on a lot of the research and work that James Loewen did. So we want to do that as we kick that off. Ross, you anything you want to mention additionally about that?
Well, Michael, thank you. Thank you for the invitation. Pleasure to be here, and thanks to all the people who registered. I'm really excited to be here and to share some of my research with you and see the interest in the community. And I would just echo what you said about James Loewen, a great scholar, historian and sociologist. He literally wrote the book on this topic, and everyone who has followed and has researched Sundown Towns, myself included, is building off of his work. And so we cannot overestimate the impact that he's had on the study of this important topic.
Thank you for that. So, first question. Many people on this webinar are intrigued by the title of the discussion, but have no idea of what Sundown Towns were. Can you enlighten us about what they were?
Yes, Sundown Towns were communities, in most cases, towns of fewer than 2,500 people, but it also refers to entire counties in some cases, suburbs, in some cases, neighborhoods within larger cities that were all white in terms of their population demographics, by the forced exclusion of Black residents. In most cases in sundown towns, it does refer to the forced exclusion of Blacks, but there are also sundown towns in this country in which Native Americans were excluded, Mexican immigrants, Asian Americans, particularly Chinese and Japanese. Sundown towns also refer, in some cases, to Jewish people, also Catholics. And the name itself, Sundown Towns, refers to the instruction that was often given to these individuals who were discriminated against. While it might be acceptable for them to come into a town during the day, whether for work or just passing through or whatever, the instruction was to not let the sun set on you in this town.
Okay, wow. So folks may be surprised by the number of sundown towns. Can you give an estimate of the number of these towns in some of the states where they were most prevalent?
So it's interesting. The most basic question on this topic, how many sundown towns were there, is also in some cases the most difficult to answer because it depends on how we define a sundown town. There are sort of different variations, they took different forms, as we'll discuss in our conversation today. But the general answer is that there were dozens, if not hundreds, of these towns in many individual states, primarily in the Midwest, the North, and the American West, all totaling up to an estimated 10,000 sundown towns in this country.
Wow.
A remarkable number, far more than many people would suppose.
So you mentioned the Midwest. So there may be people who are surprised that they were primarily outside the South. Why were they unnecessary in the South?
Yeah, this is another thing that surprises many people, is that sundown towns are exclusively a non-Southern phenomenon. In fact, there are only maybe 2 or 3 in the Deep South. And the reason for that is that the mechanism to restrict Black movement and opportunity in the South had such a long history and was so entrenched in other forms, beginning, of course, with antebellum slavery, but then after the Civil War, continuing in terms of restrictions on voter rights, literacy acts, poll taxes, all of the ways that Black voters were disenfranchised in the 19th and 20th century. It also took the form of course, of racialized violence, lynchings against African Americans in the South. And so sundown towns really were not in existence in the South because there were these other formalized, entrenched institutional forms of exclusion. And in fact, we should also note that Black labor was so central to the economies of the South in terms of agricultural workers, in terms of construction, in terms of domestic health, that the idea that a town in the Deep South would deliberately exclude African Americans would have been damaging in an economic sense to the economies that depended on that cheap and in many cases enforced Black labor. So what we find instead is that the sundown towns that we're referring to, the as many as 10,000 that I mentioned before, are nearly all in the Midwest, the North, and the West. And those towns arose principally during the late 19th century and the early 20th century, when hundreds of thousands of African Americans were moving around the country as part of the Great Migration. And as those individuals began to move into the Midwest, the North, and the West, all white communities seeking to prohibit those migrants from settling in their towns, this is what gives the rise to sundown towns outside of the South.
So you kind of answered my next question about when did they really start to take hold. So I'm assuming Great Migration after World War I, after World War II, when the GI Bill went into effect and there would be a desire for people to move around. We'll get into suburbs a little later. And then also civil rights movement. Any expanding on that thought as far as those, does that capture it as far as?
It does, and you can even take it back farther into the late 19th century, the end of Reconstruction in 1877, which gives rise to the first iteration of the Ku Klux Klan, and you end up with Jim Crow segregation, lynchings, and the racial violence that really reaches its apex in the 1890s. It's that period in which the Great Migration begins, and formerly enslaved Black persons in the South begin to migrate north in pursuit of both economic opportunity, but also freedom from the racial violence that was endemic in the South. And so you have hundreds of thousands, as many as 1 million African Americans migrating over, say, a 50-year period that begins after Reconstruction and then up through, as you mentioned, the post-World War I and World War II eras. And so it's that migration that leads to this phenomenon that we're discussing today. And there's you can sort of quantify this just by a basic statistical analysis. So, for example, in the census of 1890, there are Black residents in communities all over the Midwest, the North, and the American West. 40 years later, in the federal census in 1930, there are hundreds of communities and counties in those same regions that have 0 Black residents, or only a handful, maybe 1 or 2. So think about that. You have Black populations in these communities in 1890. You have the migration over the next 40 years of hundreds of thousands of African Americans throughout the country. And yet by so under that, if there were no restrictions in place, we would expect the Black population of those communities, which already had Black residents, we would expect that number to increase statistically, excluding all other factors. What we find, however, is exactly the opposite, is that by 1930, the numbers of communities and counties throughout the country that have 0 Black residents, or in some cases only 1 or 2, that number has increased. And so what this means is that there was some deliberate forced mechanism by which African Americans were prohibited from settling in those communities. Indiana is a great example. In 1890, Black people were living in every county in Indiana but 1. And yet by 1930, there are 20 counties that have 0 Black residents. So this demonstrates, just on a statistical basis, that African Americans were being denied opportunities to settle in those places. And instead, the Great Migration was resulting in growing Black populations in large urban centers where the deliberate forced exclusion simply was not possible due to the numbers. I'm talking about Chicago and Detroit and in Indianapolis and Gary, Indiana, industrial centers like that, which then sort of takes us into issues of the ghettoization of Black people in those large cities, the denial of economic opportunities based on segregated facilities within large cities. I don't mean to get ahead of myself here, but you can sort of see where this is going. You take the exclusion of African Americans from small towns in Indiana, and there's a direct line over this time period to issues of ghettoization in places like Chicago and Detroit.
Wow, you framed that really well. And I thought about when you mentioned Indiana, which would go hand in hand with, something that Indiana had, 1925, the largest number of Ku Klux Klan members in the country, which many people are surprised about, but that fits perfectly with what you said. There are several ways in which sundown towns were announced, from the subtle to the blatant. Can you talk a little bit about the various forms of that type of intimidation from town to town?
Yeah, this is another fascinating aspect of this history, and given the ubiquity of these towns throughout the country, it's often difficult to generalize because the forms of exclusion were varied across the nation. Everything from forced violence, for example. And so often sundown towns would come into being as a result of white-led riots in which African Americans were directly forced to flee for their lives, often resulting in the destruction of their homes, their businesses. It would result in the murders of many African Americans as they were attempting to flee the city. The example that our participants today are perhaps most familiar with in that regard is the Tulsa massacre in 1921, which has been in the news in recent years. Now, Tulsa is an example of a community that was not a sundown town. It never was, simply by virtue of its size and the numbers of African Americans that lived there. It was simply not feasible to drive out the entire community. But nevertheless, it's that type of white-led riots and the forced exclusion of African Americans that led to sundown towns. And so in those cases, to come back to your question about how these towns and these prohibitions were announced, it would take the form of police observing any African Americans passing through the town during the day, arresting them, or at a minimum, following them to the city lines, making sure that they made it out of town. In the absence of police, you also had individual white residents of those communities who, the moment an African American was observed, they would follow them to the city line, making sure they got out of town. And in many cases, those sort of escorts, if we may call them that, were accompanied by beatings and even lynching. So the threat of violence was very real in the enforcement of these towns. There's also an extensive record of signs being posted at the city limits, sort of both ends of the highway coming in and out of the community, a sign announcing it as an all-white town with a sign saying things like, if you're black, Negroes, don't let the sun set on your black ass in this town. Forgive my language, but these are the types of rhetoric that were used on these discriminatory signs, up to and of course, including the N-word itself, which is a word I'm not going to say. So these signs were often posted and would announce the community as a sundown town. So that's one mechanism by which this was announced and enforced, sort of on the extreme, violent, discriminatory side. At the same time, however, there were sundown towns that did not have such signs and did not have such a history of racial violence. And in those cases, the policy would be announced and enforced through bureaucratic or institutional means. So for example, a community's city council might pass a resolution that prohibits African Americans from living in the town. You would have racial covenants that prohibited any Blacks from purchasing homes or even renting homes or apartments in a town. And so these were often less visible, not as overt as actual physical violence, but it's these sorts of institutional policies that were often enacted in many communities in order to restrict Black movement and opportunity.
Yeah, thank you for that. I think I reflect on a couple stories. Many people saw the movie The Green Book, and what Don Shirley experienced in his traveling. And then I also think about, and this was in Lowen's book, Sundown Towns, Marian Anderson, who was the great contralto singer, when she was in Princeton, New Jersey, and couldn't stay in a hotel in Princeton, and Albert Einstein had to, let her stay at his home because there was no place for her to stay. I also think about it. So I think when you were mentioning Anna, Illinois, which 60 Minutes did an expose on several months ago, and also Marion, Indiana. I think about the violence that occurred there to intimidate, and how the populations just decreased, went to zero.
Yes,
So go ahead.
oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, that's exactly right. Anna, Illinois is representative of many sundown towns where the instigating act that led to the exclusion of African Americans was often a real or perceived criminal act by an African American, often a murder or a rape of a white woman. And that act and the subsequent arrest and often lynching of the individual led to this sort of fury, this mob mentality among the white population, which then resulted in forcibly driving out all African Americans from that community. In Anna, Illinois, in 1909, a white woman named Anna Pelly was found murdered. Actually, she was a native of Anna, Illinois, but she was murdered I believe it was in Cairo, about 30 miles to the south, southern Illinois. And an African-American man named Will James was arrested for her murder. It's not clear if there was any evidence even linking him to the crime. I believe a bloodhound simply led police to a boarding house where he was living. James was arrested. A mob subsequently stormed the jail, and he was lynched. And then this leads the residents of Anna, Illinois, to forcibly remove all African-American residents. There were about 40 or 50 Black men, principally working in I believe it was mining, or it might have been agriculture. I'm forgetting now the exact details. And Anna, Illinois is essentially white to the present day. And it sort of developed this very perverse moniker that the name Anna, A-N-N-A, refers to ain't no N-word allowed. Mm-hmm. Marion, Indiana is another example in which a white woman was attacked ostensibly by one or two Black men, resulting in a mob that drives the African-American community from the town. This sort of thing repeated itself again and again and again. Decatur, Indiana, Joplin, Missouri, Springfield, Illinois, Abraham Lincoln's hometown. This is what happened, where a criminal act, often against a white woman, resulted in the creation of a sundown town.
And many of these people were scapegoated, weren't they? As far as there was oftentimes no evidence that the person committed the crime, but they were scapegoated. I want to go to and we've got a facsimile copy. Why was Victor Green's Green Book so important to Black travelers during this period?
Yeah, so the Green Book, Victor Green, a postal, I believe he was a postal worker in New York. He started a traveler's guide for African Americans. I think many of the participants are probably aware of the Green Book, given some of the recent movie that you mentioned about Don Shirley and some other ways that this has sort of worked its way into pop culture. The Green Book is a guide for African American travelers, instructing them, places that they could stay, places that they could stop and get a meal, specific communities to avoid. Also, friendly, African-American civic leaders in certain locales who could be relied upon for advice or things like that. And so for African-Americans who are traveling in this era, whether for pleasure or for family reasons or what have you, the Green Book was an essential guide to provide for their safety, to know where they could go and where they could not go. At the height of its popularity, the Green Book is in existence from the 1930s to the 1960s. And at the height of its popularity in the 50s and early 60s, it's used by an estimated 2 million Black travelers in this country, a hugely important mechanism by which Black people could at least have some facsimile of movement in this country.
You state that historians have found that most sundown towns deliberately hid the means by which they became and remained all white. Is that why so few people are aware of sundown towns?
Yes, I think that's true. I think that's true. This is another one of those just fascinating aspects to this history, is that sundown towns were often created on sort of an ad hoc basis. So in some cases, as I mentioned before, you might have the city council enacting a resolution or something like that. But in many cases, it was just the town sort of taking it upon itself to ensure that any Blacks who came to the town were escorted to the city limits and not allowed to remain. And what this means is that there are often very few surviving historical records of this type of exclusion. Even the signs that I mentioned before, the signs that were often posted both coming into and then going out of the town, there are actually very few photographs, existing photographs of these signs. The signs themselves, historians have looked for and have been unable to find many examples. And this is principally the result of these communities recognizing that the sorts of racial hostility that were being fomented were in some ways detrimental to sort of the economic or the civic health of the community. And so many of these histories were suppressed and are continued to be suppressed today. You particularly see chambers of commerce, for example, groups of businessmen and women who it's their primary goal to, sort of develop the economic potential of a community. And so town histories are often written by these sorts of civic-minded individuals, these town boosters, who recognize that boasting about, racial unrest is perhaps not the first foot that they would like to put forward. And so you end up with town histories that are sort of gloss over these issues in many ways, ignore them altogether. And what we've ended up with over time are community histories in which this aspect is completely absent, leading many individuals to the present day to not fully understand that they themselves may have been born and raised in a sundown town. I count myself in this example. I was born and raised in a small town in North Dakota. And in my experience, there was one Black family and they were only there for a few years and left. Now, do I have evidence that it was a sundown town? Do I have evidence that there was direct exclusion? No, I do not. But this is in some ways the way this history works. Because these stories were never told initially, they're not told today, and people remain largely unaware.
Is that also because there's so few books on sundown towns compared to books on segregation and lynching and things of that nature, why people are so unaware?
Yes, I think that's true. I think that's certainly true. And it also sort of comes back to this distinction that we raised a moment ago, how in some cases, sundown towns originated as towns in which Black people lived, but then there was some act of often racial violence that then led to the forced exclusion of those African Americans. But in many cases across the country, towns were previously all white and then enacted policies that prevented Blacks from living there. And so when we talk about lynchings and the Tulsa race riot, race massacre, things that happen in Anna, Illinois, Marion, Indiana, Springfield, Illinois, other places like that, these were acts of violence that occurred, leaving a historical record. But other sundown towns have gone completely unnoticed because essentially what we're talking about in that case are towns where nothing happened. If you see what I mean. There was no sort of race massacre. There was no destruction of Black homes. There was no forcing out of Blacks who had previously lived there. Rather, it's a small town somewhere in the Midwest that has always been white and has remained white due to the sundown town policies. And so documenting those communities is particularly difficult because you're essentially looking for some form of documentation for an event that never actually happened, if you follow where I'm going with this. Put all of this together, and it means that the stories that we do know about are the most dramatic ones, the ones like Tulsa or Marion or Anna, that did involve racial violence and the destruction of Black homes and communities.
Great. James Lowen, in his book, Sundown Towns, talks about the effect Sundown Towns had on whites in those towns. Can you talk a little bit about that? How whites were impacted by that, either the lack of presence of people of color or an act that occurred to drive them out, and after that time, they have been impacted by that. What did he mean by that?
Yeah, one of the most pernicious legacies of sundown towns is that once a town goes all white, so to speak, it perpetuates itself as an all white community. That is to say, once you have white residents in a sundown town who are isolated from Black residents or BIPOC individuals, whether they're American Indian, Mexican immigrants, whomever, once you have white residents of a sundown town who are isolated from the experience of others, it perpetuates the stereotypes on which the sundown town was founded in the first place. So for example, when you lack any sort of personal connection to Black residents or other minorities, and I don't even necessarily mean friendships, I just simply mean interactions with, professional relationships, barbers, domestic workers, agricultural workers, whomever. When white residents of sundown towns lacked that contact with individuals of other races and ethnicities, it reinforces the stereotypes that are based on group identity, not individual identity. Thus, it becomes that much easier for these individuals to sort of dehumanize all Black people in a particularly racist and discriminatory way, because they have no personal connection or personal knowledge of African Americans who might refute that stereotype for them. And so what I'm driving at here really is that once a sundown town goes all white, it becomes almost this perpetual motion machine by which the very racial misunderstandings on the part of white residents are perpetuated, and there is nothing to refute those stereotypes and misunderstandings.
Wow, that's powerful. So conversely, what about the effect on Blacks, not only in those towns, but in towns that would be in close proximity?
Right. Now the sort of the flip side of that then is the effect that this has on African Americans, which in many ways is much more direct. By prohibiting Blacks from residing in sundown towns, you are limiting their economic opportunities. By preventing them from purchasing homes, for example, you are sort of facilitating, as I mentioned before, the ghettoization of places, of large urban centers, Chicago, Detroit, for example, in which African Americans are facing their own sort of, those cities' own housing covenants and redlining and restrictions on housing and economic opportunity, all of which is sort of builds over generations to restrict and to minimize Black economic opportunity. So for example, when we look today at rates of Black homeownership versus white homeownership, Black homeownership is significantly lower, and that emerges directly as a result of the restriction of homeownership opportunities, not just in sundown towns, but in those urban centers where Blacks were permitted to settle. This has an impact then on generational wealth. It has an impact on access to educational opportunities. So again, sort of to come back to the point that I was making before, the restriction, the prohibition against African Americans living in a small town in Indiana may not sound like much on its own, but yet it sort of spirals out into all of these other problems, the legacies of which we are still dealing with today.
Wow, you just really explaining this and giving a great, providing great context to this.
And now, Michael, the other thing I will say then, sort of to come back to the effect on white communities, it isn't just the perpetuation of stereotypes. I mean, it's well documented that a multiracial community feeds off of the sort of cultural diversity, the economic diversity, that is to say that like a multiracial community has, in many cases, lower rates of segregation in public facilities, discrimination. It leads to economic development due precisely to the diversity of cultures and ideas that a multi-ethnic, multiracial community brings together. And so, in a sense, white residents of sundown towns who believe that they are, I don't know, protecting their way of life by maintaining an all-white community, they are restricting their own economic opportunities by denying that source of cultural diversity and the bringing in of new ideas and energy that would actually improve the lives of all community residents. I mean, this is the counterintuitive aspect of racial discrimination more broadly, right? Where the people who engage in the discrimination are actively hurting themselves, even as they believe that they are protecting themselves in their way of life.
You've given us so much to think about, so let's continue to go deep because you're taking us there. People often say things like, well, this happened a long time ago, right? Why bring it up now? It's the same thing as how we discuss racism in the present. Yeah, it was a problem back then, but Dr. King marched, we elected Obama, so racism is fixed, right? Well, not only, you mentioned not only these exclusions still happening, but we're also living with the legacy of the past, Black home ownership, which you've mentioned, all these things. So kind of continue to talk, because I was really intrigued when you emailed me that information about, people tend to say, well, that's in the past, so let's move on because it's no longer an issue.
Yeah, that's right. One of the things that historians love to talk about is not just sort of the facts of the past, the names, the dates, the people, the events. Historians also love to look at how we tell ourselves stories of the past. And we often structure the story of our collective past in ways that is dissociated from the past for the purpose of making ourselves feel better in the present, assuaging whatever guilt we might feel for past injustice. So for example, the conventional history of the national civil rights movement is often presented as Rosa Parks sat down, Martin stood up, and we elected Obama, and so racism is fixed. And we love telling ourselves these stories because it helps us to feel good about ourselves in the present. It helps us to think in terms of national progress, that for whatever sins, whatever evils may have done against African Americans 20 years ago, 50 years ago, 200 years ago, we have made progress and we exist today in a much more enlightened society where those types of things no longer happen, right? That history is very comforting to us. And this is one of the reasons that we tell the history of the national civil rights movement in that way. Now, what that means then is that when we tell these stories, the history behind them has to be something that can be relegated to the past. We can only tell a story of progress if the histories that we are telling is something that happened long ago and no longer happens today. So for example, this is why, as you mentioned before, there's a proliferation of popular and historical works about things like lynching, about things like colored only water fountains, about the Bull Connors, fire hoses and attack dogs and billy clubs in Birmingham, Alabama. These are the stories that we tell ourselves because, excuse me, because those things are no longer a part of polite society today. It enables us to relegate that history to the past and convince ourselves that we have made the very racial progress that we hope that we have. Another reason that sundown towns are not more widely known today is because it's a history that actually cannot be relegated to the past. There are still all white communities in the country, all over the country today. Now, granted, there may no longer be signs at the entrance to town saying, "Don't let the sun set on you in this town." There may no longer be racial covenants that prohibit Black residents from purchasing or renting homes. Those things are no longer a part of polite society. But yet, as I mentioned a moment ago, we are still dealing with the legacies of these towns that have remained all white, even if the signs no longer exist on the entrance to town. And so our inability to take this history and cast it as something of the past, that prevents us from telling the story as one of progress, which is what we want. Now, to sort of take this example even further, one of the reasons that you see, I believe, that you see today such discomfort among many white Americans with Black Lives Matter, with the George Floyd protests, with protests about Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri, another sundown town, incidentally, protests about Philando Castile and Tamir Rice and Trayvon Martin. One of the reasons that there's so much discomfort among many white Americans about these movements is precisely what I'm getting at. It brings stories of racial violence that we thought we had relegated to the past. It shows that they are still alive and divisive and active in the present. And any story that complicates this uplifting, progressive narrative about civil rights that we like to tell ourselves, any story that complicates that narrative results in such discomfort among so many white Americans that we simply cannot even agree on what our past is. And now, Michael, we haven't even mentioned Confederate statues and that discussion. But you see how this is all sort of tied together, right? The history that we tell ourselves, it's not actually about the past. It's about the present. It's about us and our relationships to each other. Confederate statues, they're not even about Robert E. Lee or Stonewall Jackson or anyone else. They're not about the statue itself that was raised 100, 150 years ago. Those statues are about us and about the image that we want or don't want to see of ourselves reflected in what that statue means. All of this sort of comes together in these ways that affect not only how we understand the past, but how we tell these stories to ourselves. I'm sorry, once I get on a roll, I can't stop. I just keep going and going.
This is perfect. And I tell you what, I just wish, this was not for me. You could eliminate me from the screen, but that hundreds and thousands of people would hear this conversation because you're just really outlining some really powerful things.
Well,
so I want to include the suburbs in this conversation.
Yes.
Because they weren't developed innocently. Many are unaware that Blacks were, for the most part, excluded from the suburban development opportunities. Can you talk a little bit about how this relates to our conversation?
Yeah, now suburbs are an interesting case because as we've mentioned before of the case of sundown towns, they often arose sort of on the, like I mentioned, this ad hoc basis where, sometimes it was a result of racial violence. In other cases, it was more bureaucratic in terms of housing covenants and the rest. And so there's great sort of variation in how small towns become all white. When we talk about suburbs, on the other hand, there is a direct, often, nearly always, a direct plan and process by which suburbs were kept all white. And here's what I mean by that. The growth of suburbs in the post-World War II era was fueled by a number of policy developments by the federal government. So in the 1930s, you have the Federal Housing Administration, a New Deal program offering government-backed mortgages, mortgage insurance, sort of a complete revision to the home financing system in this country that enabled middle-class individuals to make a down payment, obtain a federally backed mortgage, and then pay off that mortgage over time. And so home ownership in this country skyrockets from the late 1930s, and then particularly in the post-war economic boom of the late 40s, 50s, and 60s, you have home ownership, white home ownership, increasing dramatically in this country. Now, those federal policies, however, the Federal Housing Administration was specifically written to exclude Black homeowners. And so this government largesse, right? This is sometimes called affirmative action for white people. Government support enabling white homeownership leads to the development, especially in the post-World War II era, of suburbs. Places like Levittown, the famous Levittown with these sort of cookie cutter homes that were affordable to middle-class purchasers for the first time. Suburbs in Southern California, especially Los Angeles. Los Angeles, a multiracial, multi-ethnic community, nevertheless develops with suburbs, particularly in Orange County, that were almost exclusively white as they were being developed. And the fact that these suburbs are being developed through federal housing loans, protected by housing covenants that prohibit the sale of homes to African Americans or anyone other than the Caucasian race, as it's often written into the housing covenants. What we see happening then is that the growth of suburbs in this country, particularly in that post-World War II era, is directly structured in ways to encourage white homeownership but discourage Black homeownership. And this gets us into this topic then of a phenomenon sometimes called white flight, that as the Great Migration results in large African-American communities within the cities of places like Detroit and Chicago and Denver and Seattle and Portland and Los Angeles and all the rest, you end up with white residents within those cities suddenly moving out to the suburbs, where not only do they have the advantage of moving to an all-white community, but now they can do so affordably, economically, due to the federal housing loans that I mentioned a moment ago. All of this then is to say that the growth of suburbs is directly linked to this phenomenon of all-white sundown towns.
Oh, boy, you are really, really hitting it. So this avoidance, this is something else. I'm trying to capture this because you sent me this great information email. So exclusion was often forced violence. Those cases are often most attention grabbing. You've mentioned some of the cases was more subtle and institutional, bureaucratic, and so on. Town councils, past resolutions, et cetera, et cetera. A sundown town might be filled with well-meaning whites who would never throw a brick, raise a billy club against a Black person, but their passive acquiescence of discriminatory norms means these practices often go unchecked. So I'll tie a couple questions there. So is there anything that people can do on an individual basis in their towns to be an anti-racist so that they're able to fight some of this going on?
Right. Well, I think this is a great question that leads us back again to the pioneering work of James Loewen, because in his book, Sundown Towns, he closes his book specifically with this discussion. And the very first thing he mentions, that if we are to sort of correct these historical injustices, the first thing that needs to happen is an honest reckoning with the past, a reckoning that has not happened with regard to Sundown Towns or many other aspects of racism and discrimination in this country. As I mentioned to you previously, Sundown Towns, no doubt, were filled with earnest, well-meaning white residents who would never themselves take any sort of action against an African American. And yet, at the same time, as I said to you, their passive acquiescence of the norms and the policies in which their towns were kept all white does not absolve them of the responsibility of reckoning with this history today in the present. So the very first thing that we need to do, which James Loewen argued in his groundbreaking book and with which I concur, is an honest reckoning of this past. This doesn't mean that people need to be ashamed, that white residents of towns, sundown towns, this doesn't mean they need to be made to feel bad about their communities or ashamed. This isn't about casting blame on anyone. Rather, it's about being honest with ourselves about our history and the country that we live in today. Because whatever we want to do as far as correcting these historical injustices is never going to happen if we can't be honest with ourselves about this country's history. That's the very first thing that needs to happen. Now, once we've done that, then we've sort of opened up a space to move into actual tangible policies that can correct some of these historical imbalances. So for example, litigation needs to happen. I mean, there are sundown towns in which Black lives were taken, in which homes were destroyed, in which property was taken. That is a tangible theft from Black residents for which their heirs in the present have to have a legal claim that will be acknowledged by the courts, right? So litigation needs to happen as far as correcting the injustices of the past. This also leads us then into federal policies, say federal education policies, right? Creating educational opportunities for African Americans in the present for whom those opportunities have been historically denied as a result of the type of exclusion that we're talking about here today. Now, this brings us to the word that is a boogeyman for so many white Americans today, reparations. This is a word that often stops conversations rather than starts them. But if we can have that honest reckoning about our past that I mentioned a moment ago, we can talk about reparations in this context, sundown towns, but also a number of other contexts, specifically the enslavement of African Americans, pardon me. If we can have an honest reckoning with our past, then we can begin to discuss about the topic of reparations as far as education policy, Black homeowner policies that encourage Black homeownership, all of the ways of sort of trying to rectify those historical imbalances. This gets us back to something Dr. King wrote about how you cannot place a Black man in a race in which in which his opponents had a 200-year head start, and then simply by proclaiming everything is equal, expect that individual to compete in that race, to ever catch up, having had a 200-year head start given to his opponents. We have to recognize that true equality in this country has to do something specifically for historically marginalized peoples that was denied precisely because something was done against them for the past 400 years.
So I'm going to say this sarcastically to our folks who oppose CRT. So we're having this conversation. We've got a diverse crowd of participants. Isn't this divisive? Isn't this conversation divisive and going to cause all kinds of problems in the future because of what we're talking about? And isn't it going to harm our students and young people by finding this information out?
Yeah, That's the argument against, critical race theory, or even any discussion of this country's racial past. It comes back to what you were saying a moment ago about sundown towns. Well, this happened a long time ago. Why bring it up now? To bring up these stories now is only going to, inflame racial tensions. It's only going to make people feel bad about themselves and their communities. No, that's exactly wrong. It has it exactly backwards. The only way we can move on from these things is to be honest with ourselves. Again, it's not about casting blame. It's not about making anyone feel bad about their past or what their ancestors have done. It's about being honest with ourselves about where this country has been and where it's going.
Yeah, and I think it's an insult to people of color as well. I remember, you probably harken back, and some of us old enough to remember, Spike Lee's movie, Do the Right Thing. There were people who felt that Black folks weren't intelligent enough to go to this movie and not riot after seeing it. It's an insult to think that people can't handle the truth, so to speak, and process and go on and work together. So I want to allow time for questions. So, people have some questions of you, and while we've got you for a few more minutes, I want to make sure we get to some of those questions. So if you have questions, please put them out there for Dr. Coen regarding this. It's a really powerful discussion, and we want you to be able to ask some questions if you have some.
And I would also be interested to hear the perspectives of some of our participants. Did they know about this history? Is this all brand new to them? Did they maybe grow up in towns that they didn't realize that this was the case? I would very much like to hear those perspectives.
So someone put in the chat, and I've got my friend Johnny Jackson from Marion, Ohio, which had a riot related to this, and had some things involved. So there have been people putting in their personal experiences. Around here, you're probably familiar with Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. Fairborn was a sundown town. Wright-Pat had to kind of intercede in that and say, look, we're a government entity that has a diverse workforce, so this cannot be. So really interesting. And we've got people who have experiences from all over the country. One of our professors here who's been active in the chat, Marita Abram, went to school in Michigan, in Western Michigan, which was very, but had not much diversity other than, I think you got Benton Harbor, but other than that, places like Holland, Adrian, places like that, very small Black population. So let's see what we have out there. The use of redlining is a way of quietly promoting sundown towns. How do we work to get great spaces for Black people to overcome redlining?
Boy, if I had an answer to that, I don't know. Yeah, no, you're exactly right. And I hate to keep sort of beating the same drum here, but I always come back to the fact that the what's happening in the present has a direct connection to what happened in the past. So redlining restricted African Americans to specific locales within cities. I live here in Seattle, and the Central District was traditionally a red line district, away from the waterfront, away from all of sort of the prime real estate in Seattle. And so redlining, which is the process of grading housing loans in terms of risk, parts of communities where the most African Americans lived were also often graded as grade D, which was colored red on the maps. And so this leads to a failure of federal investment into those neighborhoods, into those communities. So that's sort of the historical, fact of these redline communities. But of course, what we're seeing now today in the present is the increasing gentrification of those communities. And so now, as investment is being made in, for example, the Central District here in Seattle, in terms of business investment, the opening of restaurants and hotels and things like that, increasing numbers of affluent whites are beginning to purchase old homes in these red light districts and then renovating them. And so this process of gentrification then is forcing the African Americans who have lived in these neighborhoods, these communities for generations, to be no longer able to afford to live there and are moving out. And so, gentrification today, which is happening in communities all across the country, again, you can draw a direct line between that and the redlining of the 1940s, 50s, and 60s. How do we fix it? I'm not sure I have an answer to that.
Okay, let's get another. Someone said just incredulously, how did the state government and federal government allow this to happen? I guess they just can't, they're just shocked by this. How could this possibly happen? I will add and let you expound on it that the federal government, state governments participated. So it was not just allowance, it was full participation in some of these practices. But go ahead, you're our expert, I'll let you.
Yeah, that's just what I was going to say. Another way to ask that question is, how did state and federal governments encourage this practice? That's exactly right. It's interesting to me that you mentioned a moment ago, Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. Historians have done some really interesting work lately about how the US military has actually been the most progressive governmental institution with regard to race since World War II. And it's precisely what I was getting at when I was talking about the pernicious effect of sundown towns on the white populations. The military, more than perhaps any other federal or state institution, has done such a tremendous job of exposing its members to people of other races and ethnicities that it has led actually to sort of a greater progressive outlook on diversity than exists in society at large. I'm not saying racism doesn't exist in the military, don't get me wrong. But there are a number of instances of communities around the country with military bases and significant military populations that are the most progressive in terms of acceptance of diversity, a remarkable historical development.
And I think as you relate to that and talk about the military, we've had this conversation. I encourage people to get the book Unexampled Courage about the story of Isaac Woodard. So Isaac Woodard was a soldier, Black soldier in his uniform who was beaten and blinded by a police chief in South Carolina. And President Truman was so impacted by the incident, that's what led to the integration of the armed forces in 1948. And a lot of the civil rights fight started with what happened to Isaac Woodard. So that kind of background with the military and what, Truman, a lot of, FDR gets a lot of credit. I would argue that, Truman showed incredible courage, compared to former presidents as far in this space. He was the first president to speak to the NAACP, which, founded in the early 1900s, but no president had addressed them until Truman did in 1947, I believe. So yeah, that DNA, so to speak, was started way back then in fighting this. Pull some more questions up here. Let's see. Someone asked about what critical race theory is. And once again, I'll introduce it and then you can kind of expound on that. So, for one thing, these arguments in school districts is ridiculous because critical race theory is not nor never has been taught in K-12 education. So we're talking about something that you need some context, some expertise to have the conversation. And typically critical race theory is something done in grad school and law school. So with that, go ahead, Ross, and talk about what critical race theory is and really why it's not a boogie person, so to speak.
Yeah, you're exactly right. Critical race theory is often misrepresented by its opponents in sort of a straw man argument, as though it's sort of a way to indoctrinate students, even elementary school students, in sort of the evils of this country and the notion that white people are to blame for everything. And it's a straw man argument, and it's complete nonsense. Critical race theory developed in the 1970s and 80s by some influential scholars, Derek Bell, for one, Kimberly Crenshaw, another, simply as sort of a framework for understanding how, like what Kimberly Crenshaw calls intersectionality, for example, this notion that for her, being Black and a woman, those two statuses sort of come with their own histories of oppression and discrimination. And then when you put them together, it's sort of those discriminations interact in ways that oppress peoples in new and often more damaging ways. So critical race theory is simply a framework for addressing this country's history of racism and discrimination, and looking at how different, specifically how different institutions of the state have operated historically to marginalize certain communities.
Like what we're talking about today.
Like what we're talking about today. This is sometimes called a phenomenon of racism without racists. That is to say, residents of Sundown Towns or bureaucrats in the Department of Housing and Urban Development, they don't necessarily have to be racist themselves, actively oppressing historically marginalized peoples. When the structure of a society is such that it favors one group of individuals and disadvantages others, that sort of institutional system takes on legacies and operations, irrespective of how the members, the people within those institutions may personally feel. And so critical race theory is simply a way of looking at American history and the way that our institutions have marginalized certain individuals. I'll mention, but we can move on to more questions, but before we go off of this, you mentioned a moment ago when we were talking about, reckoning with the history of Sundown Towns and with racism and discrimination more broadly. And you mentioned, people are smart. I mean, they get this when they're presented with it. I see this every day in my classes at the University of Washington. I have college freshmen, 18-year-old kids who come into a class. And when we start talking about issues of racism, discrimination, Sundown Towns, they don't collapse into tears. They don't delve into histrionics about how unfair all of this is. They absorb the information. They realize what it means. They begin making connections themselves about their lived experience and the history of this country. And it's so, and they sort of emerge from this experience understanding more about their country and understanding more about themselves. 18-year-old college freshmen can do this. And so we should not be afraid of being honest with ourselves, of being honest with ourselves about this country's history.
And I find it interesting that the people who would oppose it know nothing about history. So they oppose what they know nothing of. And it's just absolutely ridiculous. Let's get one more question. So Johnny Jackson says in Evanston, Illinois, and Amherst, Massachusetts, they're creating reparations movements. There's also an equal justice initiative. Can you connect the equal justice initiative and local calls for reparations for us? So while you're thinking about that answer, I think the conversation, when you talk to people about what reparations are, I think you oftentimes have to ask the question. So my grandparents lost their home in the Tulsa Race Massacre and never received, recompense for that. So the question I would ask is, Shouldn't they receive something? Their home was destroyed, burned to the ground, and they never received a dime. So people think reparations, they think slavery, how do you figure out? But there are thousands of cases where people had property destroyed, stolen, people were murdered and killed, and we would do that. We do that today consistently when those things happen unjustly. So I'll tee that up and let you kind of go from there with that question. Thanks, John.
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question. Michael, you're exactly right. I mean, in certain cases where the actual destruction of homes, theft of property can be documented, there are legitimate legal claims there that should be recognized by this nation's courts. But I think one of the things that makes the term reparations such a boogeyman and so discomforting to certain white Americans is this notion that reparations simply means writing a check to individuals, and why should my tax dollars be given to someone else? Given is the word here, right? Be given to someone else for something that happened 150 years ago that I did not personally participate in and for which I should not be held personally responsible. That's that straw man argument about the opposition to reparations, that it's simply writing a check and giving money to people who are undeserving of it, right? But we need to sort of reframe our thinking about what the term reparations means. If reparations, rather than simply writing a check, if it actually means public policies with regard to housing, with regard to education, with regard to economic development opportunities, with regard to job training, if reparations means public policies that increase both funding and access to those opportunities for historically marginalized peoples, that becomes a way of attempting to sort of balance the ledger or to use the metaphor that I mentioned before with Dr. King, rather than placing a Black man in a race in which his white opponent has a 200-year head start, reparations might be policies that help to bring sort of equity into that race, right? Create not merely equality of opportunity, but also equality of condition. And if we can think about reparations in that sense, as sort of a helping hand for peoples who have previously been denied those types of opportunities, it becomes not an act of generosity, it becomes an act of simple justice. And that's what we should be advocating for.
Dr. Coen, Ross, this has been such a powerful discussion. Thank you for spending your time with us, having to get up early because you're 3 hours time difference, but we appreciate it.
That's true.
And we're going to invite you back at some point in time. We want to have some other conversations. I'd love to hear your discussions about Black cowboys in the American West and those things. Thank you all for participating and joining in this very important and powerful conversation. Stay tuned for other discussions. Go to our webpage and our calendar to find out all the things we have going on. So thanks all of you. Thank you, Dr. Coen. And we will see you all soon. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, everyone.
Keep Dr. Coen on when you get everybody off. Ross, if you could stay on for a couple minutes.
Of course. Oh, it's so gratifying to see in the chat all the people who enjoyed the. Oh, this is wonderful.
You knocked it out of the park. I mean, so that brings me to a couple other things that I want you to think about. We're having, and no answer today, but consideration, we're having a redlining reception. It's November, excuse me. It's going to end it for everybody? Yeah. Even him? Okay. let's see. Well, we can have this discussion. That's fine. Don't end it then. So we're having a redlining reception November 8th, and I'd like you to consider that we've got this exhibit that we have, and it's actually going to be 3 exhibits in one. It's going to be the National Red Line exhibit specific to Dayton. It's also, we've got an Atlas of Dayton. A professor at University of Dayton has, she's a graphic designer, she has an exhibit. And then we've got GIS students who have made these incredible GIS maps of various things, green space and all these types of things that they have, and we're doing that. So I'd like you to consider that.
Yeah, that sounds great.
I don't know if, I know that that's not far off. So in fact, offline, I'll email you, but I'll consider that. And also, I think about, I think it'd be a powerful conversation. Something else a lot of people aren't aware of. The Black cowboys, American West, not realizing 25% of all the cowboys were Black. If you include Mexican cowboys, you're talking about 33%, a third of all the cowboys were Black or Mexican. So I'd love to have a conversation about that, probably during Black History Month. We have programming. So I'd love for you to consider that as well. I think that would be powerful. I don't know how much research you've done on that or how comfortable you are talking about that, but that's something else. That's kind of like, that's akin to Sundown Towns. Nobody knows that. So
Yeah,
I'd love to have a conversation. I think we've got pretty good chemistry here, and I'd love to have that conversation with you about that if you consider that as well.
Of course, yeah, that sounds terrific. I haven't done research into Black cowboys myself, but teaching the West, I do teach that history. So, but yeah,
So you got what? October, November, December, January. So you got about 4 months to get all stuff together.
More than enough time.
So
yeah, that sounds terrific.
So I'll email you about this reception, and then also if you consider, and I'll be in contact with you about that presentation on Black cowboys as well. But thank you so much. This was tremendous. We're going to record it, and I'm going to work with IT. If you're fine with it, we'll get it put out on our YouTube and get even more eyes on it. People need to hear what you got and got to say about this. This is fantastic.
Well, good. I'm very glad, and I appreciate the invitation very much. So thank you.
And thanks for getting up for us. And
yeah,
talk to you soon.
Sounds good, Michael. All right, have a great day.
Too. Thanks.
And thank you, Jason, for your help.
Absolutely. Have a good day.
All right, you as well. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Jace. He was good.